This video is an explanation of the reading comp passage about Clovis First and Solutrean Theory. So this could be watched in conjunction with any question about the passage. Of course, each question has its own video explanation, so the individual questions would be discussed in those individual video explanations. Now, if you're doing a bunch of questions about this passage, I would suggest not watching this video until you're done with all the questions, because this is going to go through the passage itself in depth, and you should have your own understanding of the passage and have that understanding fresh, at least for your first pass through the questions. All right, let's look at this passage. It's a long passage. As to when the first people populated the American subcontinent is hotly debated. Okay, so this is what it's about. When were the first people here in the Americas? Until recently, the Clovis people, based on evidence found in New Mexico, were thought to have been the first to have arrived some 13,000 years ago. The evidence gathered from other sites suggests that America had been settled at least 1,000 years prior to the Clovis. Okay, that's interesting. So some people think that the Clovis people are first, and then there's evidence against that. The Clovis First idea, nonetheless, was treated as gospel, backed by supporters who, at least initially, outright discounted any claims that suggested precedence by non-Clovis people. All right, so it seems that this is one school, the Clovis First school. This is a really strong school, and they're very clear about what they believe. This is using some strong language here, treated as gospels, and outright discounted any claims. That's very, very strong. So we're not even going to listen to any evidence that contradicts us. So this Clovis First school is a very strong school. Well, such a stance smacked of fanaticism. Proponents of this Clovis First school did have a solid claim. If the Clovis people crossed the Bering Strait 13,000 years ago, only after it had become ice-free, how would a people have been able to make a similar trip but over the ice? So in other words, this Clovis First school, while they seem to have very, very strong views, they do have some good points. And this is one very good point right here. If the Clovis people waited until there was no ice on the Bering Strait before they crossed, how anyone that came before would have to cross on the ice, and how on earth would they do that? So that's very interesting. A recent school of thought, backed by Weber, provides the following answer. So this would be another school, a different school opposing the Clovis First people. The pre-Clovis people reached the Americas by relying on a sophisticated maritime culture which allowed them to take advantage of refugia, or small areas in which aquatic life flourished. Thus, they were able to make the long journey by hugging the coast as far south as to what is called British Columbia. Additionally, they are believed to have fashioned a primitive form of crampon so they would be able to dock in these refugia and avail themselves of the microfauna. Still, how such a culture developed in the first place remains unanswered. All right, so we had our Clovis First position, and this is another position now, saying that yes, there were people before. They didn't cross on the ice. They hugged the coast. They were a maritime culture. They were sailing. So they sailed around the coast, and they kept on docking and docking and docking. They'd find all these little places to dock, these refugia, where they could fish, they could find food, they could find sustenance, and then they could move on. Now, why they were doing this, how they got started, how they got the bright idea to do this, all that is unanswered. The Solutrean theory has been influential in answering this question, a fact that may seem paradoxical and startling to those familiar with its line of reasoning. The Clovis people were actually Solutreans, an ancient seafaring culture along the Iberian Peninsula, who had, astoundingly given the time period, crossed into the Americas via the Atlantic Ocean. Could not a similar Siberian culture, if not the pre-Clovis themselves, have displayed equal nautical sophistication? All right, so this is a third possibility. So this is explaining, first of all, perhaps the origin of the Clovis people, and it also might be explaining how the pre-Clovis people operated. This ancient seafaring culture that had nautical sophistication, enough nautical sophistication to cross the Atlantic And we're talking about something before 13,000 years ago. So this is truly astounding. Even if one subscribes to this line of reasoning, the Clovis First school still have an objection. See, this is a strong, stable school, the Clovis First school. And they have another good objection. Proponents of pre-Clovis people rely solely on the Monteverde site in Chile, a site so far south that its location invites yet another question. What of the 6,000 miles of coastline between the ice corridor and Monteverde? So in other words, here, if the pre-Clovis people are saying that they came around the Bering Strait and they're hugging Alaska and British Columbia, they were way up there. How come the only site is way, way down 6,000 miles away in Chile? Besides remains found in a network of caves in Oregon, there has been scant evidence of pre-Clovis people. All right, so that seems like another very good objection from the Clovis First school. Nonetheless, Mead and Pazinski claim that a propitious geological accident could account for this discrepancy. Very interesting. Propitious, very lucky, something very fortunate here accounts for this discrepancy. Monteverde, so this village way down in South Chile, was located near a peat bog that essentially fossilized the village. So that's interesting. So the reason that these folks are preserved is because they happen to be next to a peat bog. Archaeologists uncovered 2 wooden stakes, which at one time were used in 12 huts. Furthermore, plant species associated with areas 150 miles away were found, suggesting a trade network. So in other words, the existence of this particular settlement at Monteverde, it wasn't isolated. They were trading with a bunch of other people, and so there was actually evidence of this whole civilization that was pre-Clovis. And it's very interesting. This would also answer the question why we hadn't found any other settlements between British Columbia all the way down to southern Chile, because the only reason this place in southern Chile was preserved, it happened to be next to a peat bog. And if none of the other locations all the way up and down the Pacific coast, if none of them happened to be located next to a peat bog, they wouldn't have been fossilized, they wouldn't have been preserved, and we would have no evidence of them. So this is why we would have no evidence of them, even if they did live all the way up and down that coast. Very interesting. These findings indicate that the Clovis may not have been the first people to reach the Americas. So this casts tremendous doubt on the Clovis First people. If this view is correct, it is a coherent alternative to the Clovis First scenario. Yet more excavation, both in Monteverde and along the coast, must be conducted in order to determine the extent of pre-Clovis settlements in the Americas. So this is the end of the passage. We get to the end of the passage. No big conclusion has been reached here. We've heard about the Clovis First school, and they are very determined. They think they have the answer. And they have lots of powerful objections, but we've heard about this other school and the Solutrean hypothesis in particular that seems to explain not only the Clovis people themselves, but also explains how the pre-Clovis people could have gotten there. And we get this very interesting explanation of why the evidence for the pre-Clovis civilization may be the way it is, why we're only finding one site in southern Chile and not much anywhere else. And so we get a conflict between these two schools and not a clear resolution. The most we can say at the end is we need more evidence before we can come to a definitive conclusion between these two different points of view.